Good morning. I'm Joan Day, and I'm substituting for Mary Kavanaugh, who is recovering from a very bad cold, as I think most of the people in the cottages are. And today is Thursday, May 9th, 2013. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest this morning, someone you may not yet have met because he and his wife, Joan, in the front row right here, travel a great deal, as much for the pleasure of their other homes as to see their daughters who are scattered all over the country, so to speak. They have homes in Cambria as well as in Lake Tahoe, and so I think they're going to shortly go up there for a short visit, so we can all envy them that. Richard Phillips, who goes by Rich, is a chemical engineer. He has degrees from UC Berkeley and Yale. He was a faculty member at Harvey Mudd College since 1966 and is a winner of a very prestigious honor from the National Academy of Engineering. Stuart Oskamp is with us today to interview Rich and will help us understand and appreciate the busy lives of the Phillips family. Stuart is famous at the Gardens for successfully producing and directing at least 3 years of wonderful Folly shows, as well as being a retired psychology professor from Pomona College. Stuart, will you introduce our guest?
Thank you, Joan. Well, Rich, nice to have you here, and let's just begin at the beginning, or even before the beginning, and tell us about the family background and where you grew up.
Well, I'll be happy to do that. Thanks for having me. I'll start out by saying, yes, we have a place up in Cambria, and when it's really hot here in Claremont, we're always here. And when it's nice and cool, that's when we go up to Cambria. So it's taken us a while to figure out where we should be. To start, I was born in Albany, California. Now, Stuart always, when we were rehearsing a little bit, he always said, "Is that near Berkeley?" Yes, my parents lived in Berkeley at the time. And one of my trivia questions for our dinner last night was that my picture was in the paper the day I was born. Now, it didn't go very much past Berkeley, I have to admit that, but it's because I was born on Franklin Roosevelt's birthday, and so in 1934 they put my picture in the paper. On my father's side, I'm a third-generation Californian. My father was born in Grass Valley, California, as were two of my grandparents at around 1870. And I just can't help but say a little bit more about Grass Valley for those of you who don't know anything about it. It's on Highway 49, and for years it was the center of the gold mining industry in California. It's where there's a site in the town where it was first discovered that gold ran in veins. That was the end of placer mining and the start of deep shaft and and they call them shafts and drifts. And the town is undermined by tunnels, and some over a mile deep. And at one time during gold producing period, over half the gold produced in the state came from one mine in Grass Valley, the Empire Mine, which those of you who may have read Angle of Repose, that was the setting of the Empire Mine in Grass Valley. So that's my background in California. Was I supposed to say anything more?
Well, you mentioned that your grandfather had been a miner.
Yes, my grandfather had been a miner, a hard rock miner. It's a horrible life. His mistake was he didn't own a mine. He worked down. So it's a very tough life. 6 days a week, you go down into the mine before the sun comes up, and you come out of the mine after the sun goes down. So it was, but that was my family history in Grass Valley.
Mm-hmm. And then you were actually born near Berkeley, and what was life like there?
Well, to start with, I didn't know too much, but we had moved up to Grass Valley. I came back to Berkeley in the 4th grade and then went through all the Berkeley public schools and high school, junior high school, and then on to, went across the street, went to Cal, Berkeley. Yeah.
Just across the street.
It was across the street, that's right, yeah.
And I believe your family had a dairy near Berkeley? Or
Yeah,
in Berkeley?
one of my grandmothers had a dairy in Berkeley. If you go to Berkeley now, you don't think of it as a place for dairies, but in those days, a dairy could be 6 or 7 cows, and that's what she had. Yeah. If you know the area, there's a dairy company now called Farms in Berkeley, and that's considered quite humorous. But it wasn't the same, but that was how it was started. Yeah.
And in high school, you said you had a wonderful time. What were your interests and activities there?
I went to Berkeley High School. My parents had gone to Berkeley High School, and I was reasonably active in student government. I graduated with a job of planning reunions, which I've done that a few times. Unlike a lot of people, I really liked chemistry in high school. I never got over the fact that you could take 2 colorless liquids, pour them together, and a solid would. I just never got over that. I thought this was just like magic, and I just fell in love with chemistry, and saw that all the way through. But at the time I went to college, I had no plans to go to graduate school, and I thought at the time that someone with just a bachelor's degree in chemistry was not going to have a very interesting job. It looked to me like you'd be a lab technician. So I changed to engineering. So I my major was chemical engineering. And
You decided to go to Berkeley right across the street, and what were the considerations about that?
well, partly it's something that we could afford to do, but also,
Because there was no tuition.
well, yeah, maybe I should mention that. Some of you would be aware of that. At the time that I went to Cal, there was no tuition. And I didn't really realize it till later in my own life that this was one of the great statements of the people of California, that you could go to a sort of world-renowned public institution and not pay any tuition. And of course, that's changed now. So this sort of really wonderful concept that a great university would be open to anybody without paying tuition has been lost from Cal. Of course, we paid lab fees and things like that, but yeah.
You also told me that they had to accept you if you had a B average, so that everyone automatically got in if they were a good student?
Yes, in those days it was a B average and you got into the University of California. I think now, if you have actually an A+ average, that's no guarantee that you're going to get in there. So, as most of you know, times have changed. That's right. Yeah.
So what did you major in, and then what were your plans after college?
Well, I was in those days. Those of you who went to a land-grant college remember that men had to take 2 years of compulsory ROTC. And it was the time of the Korean War, and I wanted to stay in ROTC, but I was in the Air Force ROTC, and my eyes weren't very good even then, so maybe I told Stuart this story or not, but to qualify for the last 2 years of Air Force ROTC, I had to take a physical exam, and I got into the examining room ahead of the doctor where they were going to do the eye test. And I memorized the chart, and I passed. But then the next step was blood pressure. And I flunked the blood pressure test because I was cheating on the eye exam. So I stayed out, and then I joined the Army ROTC, which led me to later on be commissioned, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute.
And you met Joan at Berkeley?
And met Joan at Berkeley, Joan had gone a year here at Pomona College, had gone to high school in Claremont, to a girls' collegiate, which I think there's about a half a dozen ladies here who went to girls' collegiate, but we met up at Cal. Yeah.
So after you graduated, what were your plans?
Well, my plans were by that time to go to graduate school, which I did, and went to Yale.
Why?
Well, because I always wanted to go there, but it wasn't in the cards for me to go as an undergraduate. I went first to get a master's degree, and then when I looked around and I was given a thesis project, and I'll describe it in just a second briefly. It turned out when I looked at the other PhD students, they weren't doing anything harder than I was supposed to do for a master's degree. And so I proposed to my professor that I could stay for a PhD, and he agreed, and he didn't change my thesis a bit. So I was going to work too hard for a master's degree, I think was what it was.
And what was it you were working on?
I was working on diffusion of hydrogen through steel. If you get hydrogen hot enough and high enough pressure, it can go through steel, through metal. The practical application is that when it gets into a steel, something called hydrogen embrittlement forms, and the pressure vessels will fail much lower pressure than they're rated to be with water pressure. So the reason for such research was to look at how this phenomenon happened. And it was real. Before I got there, the reason that the professor I had was interested in this is we'd had an explosion in the lab that made the national news. The pressure vessel failed at about half the pressure that it's supposed to have been able to take. And so that led to this sort of thing. When I left Yale, the highest salary I was offered was at Rocketdyne out in the valley, and they wanted me to continue my thesis. And I got to tell you, I had enough of high pressure, high temperature hydrogen. That was enough for me. I didn't want to even ever see it again, so that's not where I went. Yeah.
So you weren't going to have another explosion.
Yeah, I never had an explosion, but I suppose it's like a doctor or a nurse who never has anything go wrong, never wants anything to go wrong. So I just didn't want to ever sort of see that again. Right, yeah.
So where did you go instead of Rocketdyne?
Well, I briefly worked at Stanford Research Institute, that's SRI now in Palo Alto. But what happened was the United States Army came and found me again, and it was my time to go in. I'd been commissioned. I'd spent 4.5 years in graduate school, and I had never went to a reserve meeting, but as it turns out, in those days, if you were in the military and you served a certain period of time, you either be promoted or let go. So having never attended a reserve meeting, I was promoted to first lieutenant on the basis of passing a physical exam. And so that was how it was. So I went into the military chemical corps at Fort McClellan, Alabama, as a first lieutenant.
And you had some interesting times in Alabama that you.
This is 1960. This is 1960 to 62, and the Fort McClellan Army post just outside of Anniston, Alabama. This was very early in the civil rights movement. Those of you who may remember some of the incidents, the very first bus burning was in Anniston, Alabama, while we were there. It was a very fast-moving thing. After that, the acknowledged leader of the Ku Klux Klan, where we were, ran for sheriff. Now, I told Stuart earlier, I think he won. I can't really vouch for that, but here's an open head of the Klan running for sheriff. So it was quite a society. in '62, when Joan and I came home to California when I was on leave from the Army for Christmas, the restrooms in the Birmingham airport were integrated. Segregated when we left, a week later when we came back, integrated. So that's how fast things are moving. Not in people's minds, but because the government made some government facilities do such things. It was a dry county, Calhoun County, and one of my favorite stories there is my commanding officer, Colonel Smith. One day stopped by my desk just to say he was going to the country club. Now here's what happened. The sheriff had called him and said, we're going to raid the country club, so all you people who have liquor at the country club are supposed to go out and get it out of there before the raid comes. So that's how law worked back then.
The law helped some people.
It was good for some people. The law was good for bootleggers, in fact. They loved the fact that the county was dry.
You mentioned the preachers had something to do with that.
Well, the preachers kept it dry and the bootleggers kept it dry. I mean, all together. I have one other short story that I'd like to tell about this because it dispels some people's attitudes that they may have about the military. We met there Captain Nord, Al Nord. Captain Nord had been an enlisted man in the Second World War, went back to college, became a Rhodes Scholar, and then decided to make the military his career. He thought serving the military was a high calling. And he had dinner with us when we were living in the Bay Area on his way to Vietnam. And to make this story short, Captain Nord became a general. He went back, was a commanding general at Fort McClellan, Alabama. And the one thing we missed was I really, really wanted to go back to the Fort McClellan and be the guest of the commanding general for dinner at the Officers Club, but I never could. We never could get that pulled off. He was a remarkable, fine man. It was a pleasure to know him.
What did you do after the Army then?
After the Army, I was discharged in '62. We moved back to the Bay Area, and I worked as an engineer for Chevron at their Richmond refinery, although I was in research. I was in Chevron research. And I think I even thought at that time that I'd like to eventually teach, but I thought that to teach engineering, it would be a good thing to have made your living as an engineer. And I mean, go to the cafeteria, carry a talk with other people, really live as an engineer. And because I think that helped me when I talked with students how it was going to be for them when they go to work. And so I'm glad I did it that way. And I liked it at Chevron and was promoted reasonably fast, but it wasn't a place that I was going to stay. Yeah.
And what did you do in planning for a change?
Well, I thought after about, I guess it had more to do with when an opportunity came along, when and if. And I'd heard about Harvey Mudd, that there was this school that was really going to be doing things differently. I'll say more about that in a few minutes, but those of you who don't know the school, it's an engineering and science school where a full third of the curriculum is humanities and social sciences.
Very unusual.
Very unusual, and to this day, the engineering program at Harvey Mudd has, either way you want to put it, more humanities or less engineering than any other accredited program in the country. So that appealed to me. And after I was there, I liked it even more. It's like this. I have no complaints about my own education, but I thought what was going on at Harvey Mudd was better and was really an opportunity for those kids who got to go there. It was really a fine opportunity.
Joan was also coming back to Claremont.
Joan was coming back to Claremont because she had been in high school here, as I said earlier, and about 1 month after we arrived, our third daughter was born. So she was well along when we moved down here.
Tell us about your daughters.
Yeah, thank you. I'll say just a few words. We have 3 daughters. One was born while I should have mentioned this earlier, while I was in the United States Army for a total cost of $6.
Pretty cheap daughter.
Yeah. And we had of course, we didn't know any better, first child, but the care was just fine. We have three daughters. They all went to Condit. They all went to El Robley across the street here, and they all went to Claremont High School. Now, they all 3 of them have PhDs. Our oldest daughter lives in Ann Arbor. She works and does research in social welfare policy. It's kind of a mouthful. And her husband is a professor in the business school of health economics. Our middle daughter's a sociologist. She lives in Portland. She teaches at Pacific University, which is in Forest Grove, a town about 30 miles to the west of Portland. She's an associate dean, and I guess she'd be the department chair as well. So she's a sociologist. She's married to an artist. What's that? What they say? Don't let your daughters grow up to marry. Don't let your daughters grow up to marry an artist. I mean, that's no, he's a great guy. He's an artist. And our third daughter lives in Burlingame, California, and she's a published author, has a novel published by Houghton Mifflin and a biography of Helen Hunt Jackson published by the UC Press. And as I told Stuart earlier, the best I can describe her husband, he's a capitalist. So he's not grew up in the Silicon Valley, but he's right at home in the Silicon Valley. Put it that way.
You really started an academic family, and your parents, I believe, were not. Well, your father was a teacher.
My father and my mother were both teachers in the Berkeley public school system. Mm-hmm. My mother didn't. She didn't teach till full-time till, of course, later, much later, after all her kids were grown up. I have 3 sisters. I have 3 sisters, 3 daughters, and my first grandchild was a daughter, and I thought it was all over. But the boys are ahead 3-2 now, so here we are.
What were the kinds of things that you specialized in at Harvey Mudd?
Well, where I spent most of my time at Harvey Mudd, we have a program there called the Engineering Clinic, and I'll tell you very briefly what it is. It's a program where teams of 3 or 4 students and a faculty advisor work on a project that is suggested by industry. The college is just now celebrating the 50th anniversary of this program. And I guess that was my main mark there, other than the normal sorts of things. I directed this program for a long time, and it would have been about, I'm going to say 30 years ago now, I brought a student team right here on this stage and made a presentation on what we were doing. So it took me 30 years to get back up here. So.
Well, we hope it won't be that
Yeah,
long
well,
for the next time.
if anybody's around for the next 30, we'll try it then again.
Could you give us an idea of what a typical project was like for
Yes,
the
I'd
engineering students?
like to do that. I thought what would be a good one to describe, and this was a 2-year project sponsored by the Metropolitan Water District. Most of you, if not all, are familiar with the California Aqueduct down the San Joaquin Valley. When you look at the aqueduct, you may not have struck you as peculiar, but when you look at it, it's always full. It doesn't matter how fast the water or how slow the water is going, the control of it is to keep it always full. That's how they did it. And incidentally, it had nothing to do with my project, but it's a great engineering marvel. The pitch of that aqueduct is in the order of inches, an inch or less per mile. there's only about 3 pumping stations all the way down the valley. It's just an incredibly beautiful design, and then it's pumped over the Tehachapi's with the biggest pumps in the world. Our project, let me describe how the project came about. There was a conception that during wet years, the aqueduct would flow down, and then water would be pumped out of the aqueduct into farmers' fields, into the aquifers, and stored. And then when it was dry years, the water would be pumped back from the aqueducts below the farmers' fields and into the aqueduct. And if you have not noticed it before, the next time you're up the valley and see the aqueduct, you'll see pumping stations in and out of it all along.
If we know what a pumping station looks like.
Well, it's a bunch of pipes. It'll look like a bunch of big pipes. And the thing was, the water that comes back from the farmer's fields isn't the same that goes out. It's has many more chemicals. It'll have fertilizers and pesticides. Not horrible, but it'll be there. So our project was to model the aqueduct, take these, I think there's some 80 of these pumping stations along the aqueduct. I knew it at one time. That's as close as I can get now. And we would know the flow rates in the aqueduct, know the pumping rates know the chemical composition of what was coming in, and then our project was to predict what the chemical compositions of the aqueduct would be just before it goes over the pumping stations and the Tehachapi's, to see what additional kinds of treatment might be made.
That was because we wouldn't want to drink it until it was
Well, they have
purified.
to know what it is,
Yeah.
But it could be used in a control way too. If some farmer was pumping in stuff that was too dirty to come in, then you'd stop it from there. And there was lots of ways it could be used. It was a very difficult project, and it took us 2 years. And at the end, we had 2 or 3 papers that we published on this. And at the end, we were able. I say we, the students, were able to predict what the concentrations of water would be, in the water would be at the end of the aqueduct within 10%. Now, students thought this was pretty bad. They thought they should have it right on the nose. That was kind of real life. I said, well, this is engineering, and 10% isn't bad for this kind of a complicated modeling system. So that's the one that's the one I thought you might be interested in, because everybody takes a look at the aqueduct when they go along.
What was the makeup of the student teams, and what were their duties involved in it?
The student team typically would have 3 seniors and a junior, and we would have a team captain.
Everybody had to do
everybody's supposed to work. It didn't always look like that, but on this team, they were very, very good. One of the team members was a young man from San Marino, Matt Morris, who, those of you who know some of the local stuff, Morris Dam is up here behind San Dimas someplace. So his family went way, way back into water. And his dad was the MWD representative from San Marino, and he was on the project full-time for 2 years. He was interested in water in the dam and that sort of thing.
This was the full-time load for the students, or?
No, it's a course.
Yeah.
I should make that clear. The normal engineering course load at Harvey Mudd would have been 5 courses. This would have been 1 out of 5. The rest were, as I said, humanities and social sciences or engineering science courses.
And Harvey Mudd would get some money for the work that these students were doing?
Yes, the support was significant in those days. I think now it's about $40,000 for each of these projects. A lot of it is given to the students to spend on conducting their projects, and it's an expensive program. It's tutorial. There's 1 faculty advisor for 4 students. I think it's important for to know that this is actually teaching, but it's a very different form of teaching. It puts the professor and the students together working on a problem suggested by somebody else, and it does not have the professors and the students sort of in opposition to each other. So to me, it was the most fun of doing anything like that. It was great, yeah.
And you told me that you also had some chances to extend that program to other institutions.
I've done some work since. Keck Graduate School down here has a version of it, and I did some work for them. And I guess my most interesting visit was at Smith College in 2001. Smith College started engineering. First and only women's college to ever start an engineering program, and they had some brilliant people who planned that. Their program was essentially their version, but a copy of the Harvey Mudd program. They say it in their literature. We don't say it. That's not. They say it in their literature, and they had a program much like the clinic. And I went back there in it was. I keep trying to say girls, but they don't like girls, in the women's sophomore year, and was with them and helped them get their version of the clinic program started. It was a great experience. As you might imagine, these young women were the very first ones to go there in engineering, so they were pretty bright. These are the adventure takers, the ones that risk takers, the ones that are like to do something different. One of them had a full scholarship to MIT and went to Smith and helped start the engineering program. And then 2 years later, I guess it was, we went back, Joan and I went back when they had their senior presentations, and we were invited back to see that. So that was really a nice experience. And I've helped start some programs at a couple other places, but that's the most interesting of them.
You've also consulted with a lot of companies and organizations in addition to your Harvey Mudd work?
I don't know how many, but yeah, between 15 and 20. And of course, that was, to me, see, a lot of professors have a lot of very personal research interests. That was never me. My interests always came from outside contacts. When I learned what people were interested in doing, I sort of followed up and liked to do things like that. So I guess I needed outside stimulation rather than internal stimulation. And also, if you pardon the expression, it helped you keep sort of financially tuned up to do things like that. So, yeah.
And how long did you teach at Harvey Mudd?
From 1966 to 2002. So I'm an engineer. I should be able to do the math, but I'll.
You've been retired for over 10 years then.
Well, it'll be 13. It'll be 11. Yeah, it'll be 11 this spring.
And what have you done in retirement?
Well, I don't know, I guess how it is for other people, it sort of took care of itself. I just never had any long-range plans or goals, and everything just seemed to be fine. I never got bored, so it just sort of took. I've done a few pedagogical consulting things at Cal State LA, and that's in another, but that's about what I've been doing, yeah.
And someplace along the line you got interested in retirement homes and looked around, and how did you decide about Mount San Antonio Gardens?
Well, I guess Joan and I always thought this is where we were going to be, because we liked it. As I said, I actually was on this stage 30 years ago. And I should mention one other name. A lot of you would have known Ted Woodson. Ted was the clinic director before I was, and we were personal friends, and so we knew Ted was down here. In fact, as I find out, we live in the same cottage that he lived in, so still the Woodson cottage, right? I mean, never get rid of that.
Must be a Harvey Mudd tradition.
Maybe that's it. We have a daughter in the Bay Area. I'm from the Bay Area, still have a lot of family in the Bay Area. So we thought briefly about going back there, but when it came right down to it, we thought, well, this is where we are, and this is where we ought to be. So, yeah, so we just didn't, it seemed kind of natural. Yeah.
You moved in about 2 years ago.
2 years ago, yeah.
And then shortly after you moved in, there was a great acclaim that came to you.
Well, it wasn't just to me, but there was 3 of us who shared this Bernard M. Gordon Prize. It's a prize given by the National Academy of Engineering for innovation in engineering education. It's an education prize. It can be awarded every year, but it's not always awarded. I have 2 things I wanted to say about that I thought. I shared it with 2 others. My main contribution was the length of time that I was the director of the engineering clinic, which, if you use it made the clinic sustainable, if you want to use current words, or institutionalized the clinic. I've been at helped other schools start such programs, but they don't take always. So that's the downside of that sometimes. 2 things about the prize I would like to say, which were, well, it was a great prize.
It was a really big deal.
Yeah, it's a big deal. Financially, it's $500,000. Half of it goes to the institution, and the other half goes to the recipients. And we, as 3 of us, turned another $100,000 back to Harvey Mudd. So that's the financial part of it. And a medal. I can't forget that because I just paid income tax on the medal.
Most of us just get the medal and no cash.
Yeah. So yeah, 2 things were really nice about that. Was the first one was this year's recipient of the Bernard M. Gordon Prize is the president of Olin University, and he said last year, when we at Harvey Mudd got the prize, he said that validated the prize. So that was really a very powerful endorsement of the award. And the second one was the night, one of the evenings of reception. It all takes place back in Washington, D.C. during Engineers Week, which, if you didn't know that, that's the week with Washington's birthday is in it. At the reception, I met a guy who was on the selection committee. And he said he'd been on the selection committee for 4 years. And when he saw our nomination, they call them nominations, he said, where has this nomination been for the last 4 years? So that was a very, very powerful endorsement of the program and awarding it. So yes, it was a great time for us, and had to rent a tuxedo, had to do that. And yeah, we did.
Well,
that.
you should be very proud of all of the years of work that this prize was summarizing and giving you an accolade for.
I'm a lucky guy. I liked my job a lot, and so I never had any regrets about going into teaching. When I came down here from Chevron, my salary was cut in half, and that was just that. Joan went along with that, and so I was really lucky to end up where I was. Yeah.
Well, and we are very lucky to have you here at Mount San Antonio Gardens, and we thank you for sharing your life with us. You've been very expeditious, so we have time for quite a few questions, I think. Joan is going to lead the way. Until they get the roving mics out, if somebody has a question, I'll repeat it.
Are there any questions?
Go ahead.
Dave Minson, I just want to say in validation of your prize, I sat in on the okay. This is in validation of the prize, if you need any. I sat in on the presentations yesterday of the clinic, And I must say, I was very, very impressed with both the quality of the research that was done and the expertise of the students, their ability to define the problem and how they solved it and what the future would be. I must say it was really an excellent activity.
It's good to hear that it's still going on even though Rich has left.
Certainly amazing.
Rich, in the study of the aqueduct, did the subject ever come up about the danger that it poses relative to an agent, some poisonous agent, being put into the water because it is so exposed? If you drive up 395, it would be so easy to walk over to the aqueduct and dump a gallon of some poisonous agent into that water. Is that subject ever
No,
broached?
we never, of course, it would have been much more than we could have handled, but that never came up. But you should, those of you who, at the time I used to know quite a bit about the aqueduct. You know, you're not supposed to fish in it, but they're fish. And you may have read occasionally that someone drowns in there who goes fishing. And if you look carefully, when you see the aqueduct, you'll see handles in the concrete. And so there's spots where people can climb out of the aqueduct. You know, it's really big. It's 30 feet high, and I forget how deep, 20 feet deep. It's a very big river. But the answer to your question, although I guess a lot of us would have thought of such a possibility, it was nothing I had anything to do with. Yeah.
Maybe a new clinic will work on that one.
Anybody
questions?
else? Well, I have one point, of course. I went to Berkeley too, Rich. I graduated in 1951, but I do remember we had something that I always felt was tuition.
There were student fees.
Well, this was $35 a semester.
You can't even get a textbook for that price now.
Well, right here, there's a question.
Go ahead and I can repeat it.
Frank, wait just a minute, it's coming.
After the water comes down through the aqueduct, how is it separated out in terms of quality? I suppose just plain water is used for irrigation up to drinking water standards.
Well, are any of you aware of the water treatment plant over in Laverne? It's a beautiful structure, sort of the way they used to do railroad stations and like. It's treated. I mean, they know what's coming in, and they have treatments to take out certain bad chemicals or that sort of thing. So it's all done at once. Well, there's more than one water treatment plant, but it's all done at once, and that's a very nice visit to go over to and take a look at how they do it. So they measure it coming in, and they see what they have to do.
Just in case you thought you were the only person that's been at Fort McClellan. We were there 20 years before you. Dad was training troops there, and Mother and my sister and I drove from Los Angeles to Alabama, and we lived for a year and a half in Jacksonville, which is the other side from Anniston. And the restrooms were segregated.
Yeah. Well, that struck me as something that I might want to comment. I don't know if it was at the WAC Center when you were there, because when we were there, it was a center for the Women's Army Corps, and in Jacksonville, which is about 20 miles up the street. There's a college there, Jacksonville State College, which at least at the time was the third biggest university in Alabama, after Auburn and the university. And I taught up there at nighttime. I taught math, and one time we had a tornado, and the students said to me, we have a tornado. I thought they were pulling my leg because I was from California. I say, sit there, I'm going to go up there and tell you what's real. And pretty soon one guy said, I just can't stand it, I got to go out. Well, this car had been picked up and tumbled 50 yards away. I mean, it was a really big tornado. Took the roof off the dining room, and they closed the college for 2 months. Yeah. But I know Jacksonville, yeah.
Rich, thank you. And you were among the early faculty, really, at Harvey Mudd, and I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about the excitement of the founding of Harvey Mudd, because it really was pretty exciting in those early years.
Well, I can't talk too much about what happened before I got there, but I can try on that. I got there in '66. The first four-year class graduated in '61, so I was pretty early, but I never stopped thinking of myself as being older. I mean, all these stuff, the real founders had gone on before me. One of the peculiar things that had happened there was that although it was the college was conceived of as an engineering and science college, and I say it that way, others might say science and engineering, so I'll just say it the way I say it. There were no engineers on the faculty for a long time, and that took some straightening out. Look, it was a very exciting time. Those students who were willing, I talked about the women at Smith. Look, most of these kids who came to Harvey Mudd could have gone anywhere they wanted to, but they were adventuresome enough to try a new college and do that. So, and it took a certain kind of adventuresome faculty. Many of those first faculty left tenured jobs, and they went to a place that might not be able to meet the payroll in a couple of months. So it was a different time in that time.
Could you comment on?
Well, by the way, the president every year tells us that times are tough, and so raises will be, you get the idea there.
Could you comment on the balance of men and women students when you came and
Yeah.
now?
Harvey Mudd was always open to women. Early on, they would have been mostly in chemistry and maybe mathematics. The year I got there, the first two women graduated in engineering. Now, I think our engineering class is half women. The faculty is half women, which has the highest percentage of women faculty in engineering, except for Smith College, which is not totally women on the faculty, it's men. So that has changed remarkably. I think it's that more women think of engineering as a potential career, not like the old days where I guess engineers were thought of as people who went to South America and dug mines and that sort of thing. That's the perception has changed from those days.
Well, I think we're going to have to stop now because it's almost time for lunch, but I think we have to give a big applause to our two panelists.
Well, thank you, Stuart.
I'd like to remind
pleasure.
you that
You did a nice
next
job with it. Helped me out a lot.
next month, we're going to have Sue Smith talk about her life. She is a former mayor of Claremont, and I look forward to talking with her. So I hope you join us the second Thursday of the month at 11 o'clock. Thank you.